Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Buffalo Bills Center of the West. My name is Eric Rossborough. I am Associate Librarian and Senior Cataloger here at the McCracken Research Library. Not to beat a dead horse, but Bob, Mac, and I and everyone else are real proud of the continued great turnouts we've had for these programs. It's been really gratifying to be a part of this. Coming up, we're planning on having more in 2023. We're going to be meeting after this talk to talk about what we're going to put on. So keep your eyes and ears out. Watch the Jumbotron and your local media organs for news of upcoming talks. Without further ado, I give you Bob Richard.
Thank you for being here. It's always a pleasure. And I'm never sure where we're going to start or where we're going to end. We had a great crowd last time. We have a wonderful one today. Next year, we're going to be doing this again, but only about 6. And I'm going to get a lot of help. If you have any suggestions, please let us know, and we'll see what we can come up with. I think we're ready to start, and we'll get going. These are pages out of my book, Cody to Yellowstone, the Beartooth Highway, or the Beartooth Loop. Looking at the map up there, people always say, what is your favorite? Well, I have about 5 favorites. This is just one of them. And they don't plow the road enough for me, but starting in Cody, going up Chief Joseph Highway, Dead Indian, all the way up to the 212 Highway. I like to go to Cook City and visit Silvergate and the Northeast Gate, come back. Beartooth Lake is always a great stop, photographic stop. Island Lake, great trout fishing, hundreds of lakes. And then over the top and down into Montana, coming up at Red Lodge, Belfry, back to Clark. We'll stop at a school up here and come back to Cody. That's what we're going to do today with old photographs, a few old stories, and try and get through it here. This is people coming to Cody at the Burlington Cody Inn and where the railroad station came to an end. The spur that went from Montana to Colorado. Leaving Cody, one of the first things you see is part of a barracks that was used during the relocation center time, and it's still there. Hopefully they'll get it moved out to the Hart Mountain Center. Hart Mountain is the mountain that I always look at and say, wow, I'm home. No matter where I've been since I was a little boy, when I could see that mountain coming in on the highway and later flying in, I knew that I was where I wanted to live and spend a lifetime. Going up over towards the highway to Dead Indian, there is a syncline after you get across the first pass, and a syncline is not an indication of anything except a dip. And then you have an anticline, which is the rock formation is pushed up, and oil well people, drillers, wildcatters would look for the anticline and say, wow, we can get oil under that. And usually when they drilled, they got oil. And that was a great find. And I believe it was Jack Manning that was drilling those wells. And I could tell lots of stories, but I won't. We'll keep going. Also, you have some rocks out there on Cottonwood Creek near where they used to do the early day movies, where the Indians sharpened their some of their bone instruments that they used, and part of that rock was actually broken off and brought here to the museum. And it's just before you cross Cottonwood Creek on your way up the highway just out of Cody. Just to the south of that is a Dave Jones sign painted in the rock on the east side of the highway. And he had those painted on rocks all over the Cody area. And this is the one that still remains in downtown Cody in the alley between Beck and Sheridan, between 12th and 13th Street. And if you drive down the alley going west, you can't miss it. Next, as you look at this, you're looking at the bridge. Let's see if I can get this to work. Right here is the first bridge and a campsite. Right here where people, when they brought their wagons down this road and came in, across the bridge, and that's the camp that they made before they went into Cody the next day. This was with horses and wagons. I also used that bridge driving my Jeep in the 40s and 50s. That's a little more of a close-up, but it's still there. You can see it. This is a photograph of Patahara and the balsam root. We call it elk cabbage. On my birthday, the 28th of June, we had a very rainy, wet summer or spring, and that whole side of the mountain was covered with yellow flowers. Now we're looking at Patahara Mountain. You're looking at some of the red buttes there. And it's always spectacular. This is one of the most spectacular highways out of Cody. Looking here, you've got, looking back at the top, you're looking at Hart Mountain and the Red Butte. And again, one of my favorite sights coming back out of sunlight. This is on Dead Indian. The little photograph is my helping my dad taking pictures back in 1941, and then looking up the Sunlight Valley. And we had the Nez Perce Indians traveled through this area and came out of Yellowstone and traveled down the Clarks Fork and out. And they put a monument up on Dead Indian Pass, but they have to take those steel figures down every fall because we have people that don't have the smarts and they shoot holes in it, and they've had to repair it many times. So it's not there in the winter, but it will be there in the summer. Antelope Butte, Russell Creek, lots of history there. And this is, you'll notice that Mac Frost has added a lot of his photographs to this talk. And he and I collaborate with our photographs, and he's the photographer. I just take them and make sure that I have it captured, but he is like his parents. He is an artist when it comes to taking pictures. Here again, we're looking at several things. We're looking at Antelope Butte in the left-hand corner, then the road going down from Dead Indian. And that used to be a dirt road. This is the fourth road that's been built. And the first one was a ditch cut straight down the mountain for the wagons, and the uphill wheels were chain locked, and they cut a tree as long as they could to drag behind it, and one team of horses pulled it down to the bottom to Dead Indian Creek. And then below, you're looking at the Beartooth Mountains, Clark's Fork Canyon, and on the right side is the Switchback Ranch. It's had several names, but it's still in operation and a special part of the Sunlight area. This is a very special photograph at the top, and Mac's going to tell you all the names of those peaks, and I know you'll remember them all. Mac?
Thank you, Bob. This is a panorama that I shot very early one morning in June. I don't remember the year right off the bat. But when you look up here on the left, this is the top of Trout Peak. And over here, we have a mountain that doesn't actually have a name. And most of us locally just call it Nameless. There was a campaign at one time to try and get the get the mountain named after Dr. Dewey Dominic. They were going to call it Dewey Peak, but that effort fell by the wayside. Over here we have Dead Indian Peak. Trout Peak is the tallest mountain on this divide, which divides the North Fork from Sunlight Creek. The second highest mountain is Dead Indian Peak, and their separation in altitude is only about 15 feet. They're both very, very high, and they're basically lava formed mountains. Right here is Elkhorn Peak, which is down in the lower picture, this mountain here, and this is Dead Indian. And then way over here, that's Stinking Water Peak and Sunlight Peak. And then again, this lower picture, as you're going down the mountain, you're going down the road into the Sunlight Creek area, you come across that one really sharp S-curve. Has a wonderful S-curve sign on the roadway that looks like you kind of wonder what's coming up. When you get down to the opposite, to the bottom end of that curve, you're looking right at Dead Indian and Elkhorn Peak that almost line up with each other.
That's our Sunlight Bridge. When it was first built, I hung a sign on both ends, "No fishing from bridge." The Forest Service did not take kindly to that.
It's only 425 feet from the deck of the bridge to the water. You'd need 1.5 reels of line just to get to the water and wet your hook.
This is looking into the Clark's Fork Canyon from Russell Creek, and my dog Sue had to get into the picture, but we were down there looking at a grave site, which we'll talk about in a minute. But you'll see a draw at the top end where the families, in fact, Jack Bugus that owned the Switchback Ranch, used to take his family and go down and swim there in the Clark's Fork River in August. I don't think they spent much time in the water, but they picnicked there. Okay, this is looking from the canyon and looking up. This is Sunlight Creek coming down here, and you're looking up at Steamboat or Shiprock. You can see the superstructure, and that's all limestone. And to the right is Elk Creek. This is an aerial that my dad took from above Sunlight Creek, looking at Riddle Flats and looking on up the Sunlight Valley. You've got White Mountain at the top. You've got animals that you normally see up there. The wolf pup on the right, we were going up the highway and he was howling and apparently had been left by the pack. And a friend was driving and I unrolled my window and I howled back at the pup, and he ran right over by the door of the pickup And I looked at my friend and I said, shall I open the door and let him in? He says, no. Anyway, about a 4-month-old pup, and he heard his mother about that time and took off to rejoin the pack. But there's always wildlife, always great sightseeing. And then the bottom one is Windy Mountain. When I grew up, there was a fire lookout up there. There's a hiking trail on one side and a hiking trail down the other side. The thing I remember most hiking up there as a youngster is the outhouse was built out over the cliff. And I thought it was rather interesting, but then things changed. And it was quite windy. You know where everything blew. But this is White Mountain, and that's a lot of limestone kind of material that has bubbled up with hot water and is in that area. And then you're looking at my favorite shot of Sunlight Valley and looking all the way up the valley. This is Windy Mountain one more time. And Mac and I tried to get a photograph of the pilings for the mountain that was up there for the lookout, and they burned it down, and I don't think it's there. Is it? Yeah, well, we tried, but we didn't get it in. This is a shot that my dad took. It just shows the beauty of the mountains, and looking up one of the off of Sunlight. And when you get up there with a 4-wheel drive vehicle, you just get wrapped up in the beauty in the summertime. I always suggest you wait till July, or, well, they don't open the gates because of grizzly bear habitat. But when they open it, I think it's the 15th of July, you can go quite a ways up there. This shows the Shiprock. Next is the Lower Sunlight School. Wood cook stoves are still in most of the old cabins up there, and the happiness of cooking on them. Lee City, that was taken in about 1950. We drove up and crossed Sunlight Creek 33 times to get to Lee City. And then down on the left is Antelope Butte, the Frank Hammett grave marker. We'll talk about that. And then on the right is the wooden box that his grave was in until the CCCs reburied him. And then I read where he was actually dug up and taken back to his home community in Iowa or somewhere back east. But the memorial is still there. This shows Antelope Butte, and the memorial for Frank Hammett is just below the butte as you're climbing up the long hill headed to the north. And that's his headstone. Well, and he was a ranger up there, and all kinds of stories, but apparently he slipped into the canyon. His horse was wandering around, and they finally found him and put him to rest by this rock on Russell Creek until the CCCs got involved, and then they moved him up to where the headstone is there under Antelope Butte. As you're driving on up the road, you'll see what is called a glacial gouge. And I had a geologist, Hank Kessler, a friend of mine, said, Bob, you've seen these all over the world as you've traveled. And I said, yes. He says, well, that's a glacier that gouged that canyon out with the pressures of ice, and that's all granite, Precambrian granite. And it has literally made a valley with the pressures of ice digging it out. This is a favorite spot to stop as you're passing the Swamp Lake area, and you can always get a great reflection if there's no wind. We used to have lots of swans that lived there and had their babies there, but the last 15 years we haven't seen any swans. Still moose, but it's a great place to slow down, and the old highway used to travel right around that lake, and there is an old car that we didn't put in here that's still sitting there that was abandoned in the early days. Again, looking at Swamp Lake and the mountains behind.
That's what they call the Cathedral Cliffs. Back in 1988, when the fires were burning down from Yellowstone National Park and down through the upper Crandall area, the fires burned right along the bottom of these cliffs and pretty well wiped out a number of forest tree leases, not leases, but lumber leases is what they had. And they never were able to go in there and harvest the lumber because it got burned up before they could get to it.
This is looking back in the same area, but this is on Crandall Creek, and the white that you see there is a hayfield, and the Nielsen's built a home up there, and they wanted to fly in, and I brought one of Taggart's patrols, road grader, and it didn't have a cab on it in the late fall, and drove it in there and got it set up for a patrol operator to make a runway. And as I got off the patrol and shut it down, who was there but Glenn and Olive Nielsen to pick me up and take me back home to Cody. And they used that airstrip for a lot of years. I can remember flying in with Jack Duggleby as they took the Nielsens in to spend a weekend in their home there on Crandall. One of my favorite mountains in this area is Pilot and Index, and a couple of different shots. The one on the right was a Marine colonel from World War II that was shot down over Pearl Harbor during the invasion of Hawaii, and he survived that and was a friend of both my dad and my Uncle Bob, and I had him for a week fishing in the Beartooths and on the Clark's Fork, and he says it was the best fishing he ever had. Another shot looking at Pilot and Index, the clouds, and the fishing there is as good today as it was when I was a youngster. Here's some of the colors. This looks like yours, Mac.
It is. I actually have it signed down here in the lower right-hand corner.
We need to do it with a better signage. I
Yeah.
can't see it. But Mac is really good at getting out and getting these special shots. Grizzly bear, we have lots and lots of them now. The next shot is the Norquist Ranch, and that's the Elbar T, and that's in the fall. And of course they have signs, grizzly bear area, special rules apply. I've never seen those special rules. Have you? I keep wondering. I asked for them. And at the bottom, cabins built for Ernest Hemingway and Clark Gable in the 30s on the Norquist Guest Ranch. And you can see those from the road. This is the B4 Ranch. Fred Garlow owned it in the 40s and the 50s. And then he traded it for Absorka Lodge on the North Fork. But that's a grand old barn. I spent parts of summers up there, and I hiked in one winter over Christmas holidays with Fred Garlow, and he taught me to trap pine marten. And we actually got 6 pine marten, but we took an extra week. And by the time we got home, my mother was beside herself because I was supposed to be home and back in school, and I wasn't there. And she knew that something had happened, and all we did was catch a few extra pine marten, but she didn't understand. I don't know why. And I learned at our last talk that Pete and Alan Simpson spent a summer up there helping Freddie Garlow and driving Freddie and guests into Cook City. Of course, they were too young to have a license, but they had a great time driving that road and taking guests back and forth. But we all did at that age. And anyway, good memories. Another shot, the upper one of the barn. And then across from the B4 is Crazy Creek that comes out of the Crazy Lakes, full of rainbow trout. And believe it or not, below the falls are pretty good fishing, and up in the Crazy Lakes, great fishing. This was taken in the early 50s, and that's my mother coming out of the Crazy Lakes on horseback with some of Freddie's guests. And we spent a lot of time up there. This is another shot of my mother back in the early 50s. This is an interesting deal. It's at the Clark's Fork, where you can read about who lived where their homesteads were on Sunlight and all the other creeks. And I photographed it because I always have questions of who lived on Russell Creek. Like Art Brayton is the last one on Russell Creek. Well, the history going up on Russell Creek is amazing, as well as all these other creeks. But here you have the names of all the old timers and how they interacted. And it's worth stopping there by the store where this sign is outside. They have one inside the store also. Okay, then we go up to Cook City, and I'm never sure whether it's the dogs that are laying in the road or the horses that are standing in the road, but that's typical when you go to Cook City. And in the distance is Baronet Peak, and that's looking west. You have a new visitor center in Cook City. They have a couple of bathrooms there, but they're free. And some of the other places in town want to charge you. And, of course, the Northeast Gate. It hasn't changed, very special. When I was a ranger, I had to go up there for 3 weeks in the spring till we got seasonal rangers to come in and man that gate. And, of course, I had to go into either Silvergate or Cook City to get my meals. And there was a bar there that had doors at both ends, and I was there with my dad, and a shoe salesman and a life insurance salesman had started the bar. They had no two glasses the same, and Dad and I were their first customers. And we sat there, and Dad says, I want whiskey and ditch. And the bartender, the salesman says, well, what's that? Dad says, see that tallest glass back there? He says, bring that over here and put it on the counter. He says, now put 2 cubes of ice in it, and then fill it half full of whiskey, and then just a little bit of water. Well, that's what they made him every time we went there that summer. He paid them well, and they learned how to make a drink after that. But another time when we were there, we had a cub grizzly come in the front door. The door was always open. And he walked right over and sniffed my leg. My first desire was to give him a big, swift kick. And about that time, the mother looked in. And she walked in, and another cub walked in. And it was a long bar, and they walked down and out through the back door. And I went over and shut the back door. And then I shut the front door, and they bought us all a drink. Anyway, we survived. And then this is, again, in Cook City, the old general store. And this is where miners came. They were going to build a railroad through the park to Cook City, and the man behind building the railroad, his name was Cook. And our legislators got wind of it and stopped the railroad. And so that didn't happen, but they mined until the middle 50s for gold and silver. And then much later, they found more gold through core drilling, and they finally put that to a stop also. But beautiful country, and it hasn't been destroyed, so that we have the use of it. This is Lake Creek on your way up 212 to the top of the Beartooth. It's a place, the highway used to go right across there. Today they built a new bridge, but that's high water and spectacular in the springtime. On the right-hand side is the Clay Butte Lookout with an alidate and some of the equipment they use for firefighting. If you get a chance to drive up to it, it's before you get to Beartooth Lake. It's worth the time to drive up. It's a dirt road, but take time and visit it. This is one of Mac's photographs of the Clay Butte. They usually have a volunteer there managing the place and talking history. These are photographs taken from there, looking at Hurricane Mesa and the Besorca Mountains, Pilot and Index, the Granite Mountains to the north, and the highest peak in Montana. Here's a nice strata of clouds in the stratosphere, telling you that probably in 3 or 4 days or sooner we're going to get a storm, but nice colors and great photograph. Another of Mac's shots, and you're guaranteed always to get those in the fall. Here's a special one with a great reflection as the water is flowing out of Beartooth Lake and Beartooth Butte behind you. Very special. And good fishing. Mac, you want to add anything?
Just the fact that Beartooth Butte is chock full of fossils. It's sedimentary layers that are layered in on top of limestone, and all of it has been upthrust by the granite mountains of the Beartooths. And this is essentially the last layer of an old seabed, but it's like I said, it's just inundated with marine fossils.
Again, another view. Mountain goats are what I always look for when I go over the Beartooths. And we got a black bear or a cinnamon bear. And then at Island Lake, you're looking at Lonesome Mountain, and there's a series of lakes. And the further you walk back, the better the fishing. But we're now getting so many tourists that they have big trails going back to most of these lakes. It's part of progress. Does anybody recognize who's catching? And it's definitely, there's several things we'll talk about, but does anybody recognize who that is? That's Freddie Garlow at Crazy Lakes, and I know darn well he's got my dad's pole. Dad's taking the picture, and Freddie Garlow's not about to put that trout in his Stetson hat, but it makes a great shot. But I can remember his taking that. Long Lake on the top, spectacular, great fishing right there by the bridge. And below is a young man that I taught to fish, Todd Frost, who is now a Marine captain, training Army how to shoot cannons and missiles, and he's part of the Frost and Richard family. And there he is learning to catch brook trout. And he says, every time he comes home on leave, he says, Bob, we got to go fishing. And it's great to go with him. It's fun. Okay, here we have some of Mac's photographs. Mac, talk about these, please.
Well, the one up on the top is about 180-degree field of view from not far from the top of the Beartooth Highway. I actually completed this picture as a full 360-degree panorama. But you can see, way down here is where Long Lake is at, and then the road comes snaking up here, and you're well above timberline as you're coming along here. And then this is another shot a little bit later, looking off into the Rock Creek Gorge. And right up in here, as you get a little bit further to the north, you'll be able to see the Bear's Tooth, for which the mountain range was named. And there it is.
That's the Bear's Tooth that got its name. And there's a little snow there.
Yeah, you'll notice the
Excuse me,
snow. Well, we'll get to it here in a second. These are a couple of different pictures that I took of the Bear's Tooth at different times, but essentially from almost the same spot. And again, these are single frames out of a larger panorama that I put together. And there's sort of that same panorama, and you can see looking out across Rock Creek, and there's the Bear's Tooth there. And then this is my car parked next to a typical snowdrift on the road. Shortly after they had opened the highway over the pass in late May. They usually try and get it open by Memorial Day. Sometimes they make it, and sometimes they don't. Here we're looking again way off in the distance. You can see the Bear's Tooth. Lots of clouds. It was a dark and stormy day, and here's one of the hairpin turns at the top of the mountain, looking down into Rock Creek. And the picture down below is taken from above the Twin Lakes, looking back at the western summit of the Beartooth Highway. You can see a car just having come across the top of the summit right there, and then here's all the hairpin turns coming down and going across. It's the only place they could have put the road. And this is an aerial shot that Jack Richard took, oh golly, probably in the 50s. But you can see the road coming up Rock Creek, and then the first hairpin turn as it goes on up and snakes along and gets way up. Here is the place where they built the Vista Point. It's not built in this particular picture. Goes all the way out onto this rock point here, and then swings around into this little canyon, and finally comes out on the top of the plateau up there and goes on up to the border with Wyoming and Montana. A couple of other panoramas. This is one of my older ones, looking from the top of the Vista Point down onto the Rock Creek Vista Point, and then this one was taken way out at the very end of it. This is a 360-degree field of view. I just stood out there and had my camera mounted on a tripod and just swung it around and took picture after picture after picture, and then stitched them together in Photoshop. As I like to say, photographs do not lie, but the photographer do.
Springtime skiing has always been a special part of the Beartooths. When they get it open, they usually ski until the middle of July when it's finally melted. The Twin Lakes on the right, and that's looking up Rock Creek. And that's a great drive if you have time, just to go up and drive up Rock Creek as far as you can go. There are campgrounds, another special place. Then you arrive in Red Lodge, Montana, and it has become quite a tourism. This year they got hit by quite a flood, and the water ran down that street all the way to the hotel. and they finally diverted it, but the tourism came to a rapid halt, and they are struggling to get their feet back underneath themselves. But can you imagine that street flowing with the overflow from Rock Creek? And then after you leave Red Lodge, you come down and the Smith Mine disaster, and one of our local boys, Bill Shepard's grandfather, was the mine manager when that exploded and killed 177 men, including his grandfather. And that put an end to the mining, and quite a tragedy, but there's a history there and part of our way of life. I stopped and walked through their office with Bill, and there were bills of lading from YP Company and all the different owners of the hotels in Yellowstone buying coal there. And the office was still intact, and their files were still there. It just totally left. Some of it was scattered on the floors, but part of the history. And then we've got Belfry, Montana. And then when you leave Belfry and head back towards Cody, you need to go see the old Pioneer School in the Lower Clark. It's a little hard to find, but if you can't find it, give me a call and I'll tell you how to get there. But when you come from Montana and you get to the first major right turn, it's a dirt road. Have they paved it now? Mac's been there since I have, but the school still looks like that. And it's called the Pioneer School. This is looking up the Clarks Fork Canyon, and that's the road that we had a gentleman by the name of
Bud
Webster that was head of the Highway Commission, and he was going to build the road through the canyon up to Cook City. And he got as far as the mouth of the canyon, and one of the winters that hit before they got any further blew about 150, 200 yards of the paved road and rolled it up. And that was the end of his highway building in the Clarks Fork.
That was also about the time that the Park County and the Forest Service improved the road up over Sunlight, up over Dead Indian.
Now the bottom photograph, there's a tent and a cabin, and Ned Frost and his wife Mary and son Chu moved into the cabin. He was just born, and in the tent was Fred and Margaret Richard, and they had their son who was a year old, and they wintered there while these two crusty old men that had married a school teacher and a nurse from Chicago, and they put them out here in the center by Bennett Buttes and along Bennett Creek, and they trapped 370 coyotes, 90 wolves, plus other animals, and these two women put up with them all winter right there. And at the end of the winter, they said, "We're not going to live here next year." And when they sold everything and got all the bounties, they bought a place on the North Fork in the Wapata Valley. But those women had to have been pretty darn tough to put up with those smelly old trappers. And then they went into the outfitting business and what have you. But notice the blanket on the cow, and they had already been doing tours in the summertime in Yellowstone. But just to get to Cody to pick guests up and take them to Yellowstone was another adventure. But anyway.
We might mention, Bob, that the one of the favorite stories about this site is the fact that it was near Bennett Creek, and there was a ditch that went from Bennett Creek and came right in by the cabin here. Well, during the spring, Bennett Creek overflowed, and so the ditch overflowed, and the ditch waters came right up to the back end of the cabin, and the men, of course, were gone, and the women decided that they didn't want the foundations of the cabin to get eroded, so they opened the back door and the front door of the cabin and let the creek flow right through the cabin. At the end of which, they discovered that several inches of dirt had been cleared off of the wooden floor of the cabin. And the men were then encouraged, rather vociferously, to clean out the rest of the muck so that the women would have an actual floor to work on. Ah, trials and tribulations of pioneer life.
Some of the animals that you see on a tour like that, and you've got a nice bull in the velvet, and moose we still see quite a few of. This is one of my favorite photographs. It's also on the back of my book, Yellowstone Country Beartooth Loop. And not only does this tell you that there may be cows on the road, we have proof that there are cows on the road. That's your talk today. It's time for questions if you have any. I hope that you enjoyed it. It's one of our special places to get out and spend a day. We used to camp up there. And any questions?
Where is the Sunlight School?
The Sunlight School, when you are crossing the high bridge, if you look to the west, it's on the hill overlooking Sunlight Creek. And the Upper Sunlight School, we helped the Game and Fish take down. It was on their property of the old Snyder Ranch further up, and that was the upper. And my mother's sister taught 2 years in the lower school, and she lived with the Paul Ritter Brown, who was on the other side of the creek, and he would go over on horseback every day and start a fire at 6 in the morning to get it heated up for the kids, and then he would take her over in a buggy and have her there by 8 o'clock, and the other kids would show up. Does that answer your question? Yes.
Please tell the story about Jack Crandall.
Jack, which story? Okay. Jack Crandall, and the creek, Crandall Creek was named after him, was a miner, and it went in the backcountry with some other miners, and they found gold and came out, and they were camped just west of the highway where it crosses Crandall Creek, and the Indians attacked them, took the horses, left their packs there, and they scalped the men. And according to the story, Jack Crandall was scalped, but he survived and crawled and walked back to Red Lodge, where he went in and put a gold nugget on the bar and said, "I need a drink." Now, he looked like you know what, with blood all over him. And it started a small gold rush, and they found the packs with the gold, but they never found the where they got the gold. And but it makes a good story, and there is a headstone if you hike up the trail about a mile from where the horse pens are to go up Crandall Creek. And another special place that you can travel is go down just before you get to the store and before you cross the Clark's Fork is Squaw Creek. And there's a road that goes up Squaw Creek to many, many cabins. Very beautiful. And the Wilders have been there for years and camped there as a family. All of Marge's life, she shared that with me today. But there's so many back roads, and it's another special place that I love. Any other? Did I answer your question, Mick? Yes.
Any
Uh,
information on Jack Rawlinson, the first ranger?
He's written a couple of books, and he, in his books, talks about being up there, and we do have some history on his time up there and his involvement with the painters and the painter family. And I'm trying to think of the name of Rawlinson's book, but call up the name.
Hoofbeats of a Ranger.
And
Pony Trails in Wyoming as well.
yeah, that's the one. Yep. He also worked for Frost and Richard and did tours when they were short of drivers and teams. And he mentions that in his book.